30-year high inflation, the carbon price jumping to $50 a ton just late last week, $9 billion in new environment promises, $19 billion in new fighter jets, the pressing need to invest more in defense with the war in Ukraine, a remarkable deal with the NDP that forces the Liberals to spend on national dental care and pharmacare. All these factors will play into this week's federal budget. But remember, the Liberals have never met a budget target in 7 years of governance. And they've blown through their debt to GDP ratio and their fiscal guardrail promises are gone. So what should you expect when you're expecting a monumental new budget on Thursday? What are the big ticket items and what are the big ticket concerns? The Scrum is here to answer all that. Joyce Napier is the CTV Ottawa Bureau Chief. Marika Walsh is a political reporter with the Globe and Mail. And our special guest this round is the man who watches all this, the Parliamentary Budget Officer himself, Yves Giroux. Okay, great to have everyone here. Yves Giroux, earlier this year you questioned the Liberals' case to spend tens of billions of dollars in planned stimulus, despite the government already reaching its own benchmarks of economic recovery from the pandemic. Now they've got new spending expectations with their deal with the NDP. What are you watching for?
Well, we'll be looking at the numbers in new expenditures because we all know there are tremendous pressures on the government to spend. There's, for one thing, the platform on which they were elected, which to this date still includes about $49 billion on net new spending that has not been implemented. There's also the commitment to reach 2% of military spending that NATO is really keen on now that there's a war in Ukraine, which in itself could add easily $20 to $25 billion in new spending per year on an ongoing basis. There's the pharmacare that you mentioned, there's dental care, and there are also demands from premiers for additional expenditures or transfers on healthcare. So all these pressures combined will probably lead to difficult choices for the Minister of Finance. And what I'll be watching for is the pace at which these measures are implemented and what that will do to the debt to GDP ratio over the next several years.
Joyce, what are you watching for? The Prime Minister's already hinted that housing's another issue that we should be watching for. What's on your radar screen?
Well, obviously all that spending. What I'm going to be watching is the defense spending. Because we know that there is a lot of pressure on Canada to reach that 2% of GDP for defense. I want to see how either they do it or how they muddle it, because sometimes it's not what is in the budget, but what is not in there, and how to read between the lines. Look, there's a lot of more spending coming down for sure, because as Mr. Giroux just said, look, you just have to go down that shopping list to know that these are more 10, 20, 30, $50 billion more, and the government keeps growing bigger and bigger.
Marika, what's on your budget radar screen?
Well, I think just broadly adding to what the other two have already said is there are all those questions about spending, these demands for spending. We know the Liberals in their election platform promised much more healthcare spending. It's not quite what the provinces want and how it's spent, but they have already promised that. So I think that's another big one that will be coming. And I think really the question is going to be, are we going to see this Liberal government making choices between spending demands, or are they just going to say, here you go, everybody? And I think that's changed a lot in the last few weeks. Early in March, we were hearing that it would be a bit more of a conservative budget, not a lot of new spending. Now with that Liberal NDP deal, it's changed.
Yeah, and the war and other things. The other item, Yves Giroux, a big ticket item is the environment. The environment minister says we can do it. We've got the carbon pricing. He claims that 8 out of 10 Canadians will still get more money from the rebate on the carbon price. You've studied that. You actually say by 2030, most people will lose money on that. So what do you expect on the environment? And can you fact check the environment minister for us so people get a good sense of the real cost of the cost on carbon?
Well, what the minister says is that 80% of households will receive more in rebates than what they actually pay in carbon tax, which is true if you look only at the carbon tax paid minus the rebate. But what we looked at was including the economic impacts of a carbon tax, which will act as a drag on the economy. What will be the situation that households are facing or will be facing as the carbon tax increases? And once you factor in these economic impacts that drags down growth, that ends up being the opposite, that 80% of households in provinces where the federal regime applies, they'll be worse off, even when you factor in the rebate, because of the slower economic growth that is the result of a carbon tax. It's not to say that the carbon tax is bad if your goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but you cannot say that it has no bad economic impact.
Joyce, next to all this spending, it's basically inflation nation. Is there pressure on Chrystia Freeland to deal with the fact that we got 30-year high inflation?
Cost of living, you mean? And that is a huge issue for not most Canadians, I think for all Canadians. So what can she do in this budget to address that? The high cost of living, and it's not going to get any better. Wages have not increased at the same rate of inflation. That's going to be the next battle. We've seen that already in some, arm wrestling negotiations between labor and management. So that will be in our horizon. So I'm expecting, probably pessimistically, very little in there to address that.
Marika, last word to you, just on the challenge. The Liberals just are not, there's no, I don't know where the fiscal guardrails are. I'll be interested in looking at that. But there's just promises, healthcare, housing, defense, the environment. Is there a concern that the spending just was never going to be reined in?
I think that's certainly a concern in the business community, and I think we saw that concern also raised by very prominent Liberals like Scott Bryson after the Liberal NDP deal was first announced. So certainly there is that concern. I've heard from one or two MPs within the Liberal caucus who privately say they are also concerned by that, but clearly the government has made the political calculation that that is not their biggest priority, it's not voters' biggest priorities. And in terms of addressing cost of living, addressing inflation, they've closed the first chapter on childcare with the deal with Ontario, and now I expect them to talk much more about housing affordability, which is the other thing they always talk about when they're attacked by the Conservatives about cost of living challenges.
Right. We're already not talking about $13 billion in the last week to Ontario for that childcare. All right, lots of money going around. Okay, it's going to be a big week ahead. Yves Giroux, Joyce Napier, Marika Walsh.